What if the light you've always trusted was the very thing that fell? Have you ever wondered what it truly meant, when the heavens dimmed not from nightfall but from the exile of one too radiant to contain? Did you know there was once a voice older than thunder who sang the first praise before time itself knew its name? Can you imagine a soul so beautiful, so woven in divine fire, that even the stars bowed when it passed? But what was so terrifying that even heaven hid it? They called him Morning Star, but the angels remember him as something else. The first to weep at the edges of the firmament, the first to fall in light. And still the silence of heaven burns where he stood. This is not the story of rebellion. It is the ache behind it, not a war in the sky but a wound in the light, a shimmering sorrow that dripped down from the highest heights. And it waits even now behind your dreams, behind your fears, behind the mirror of your soul. For once he was not Lucifer. He was the light heaven could never silence. And this is the whisper the watchers never dared speak. The tears that angels still hide in their wings. The secret that even the flood could not wash away. Let me take you there, to the beginning before the beginning, to the fall that still glows, to the silence that still sings. If your soul feels the tremble of memory, if your spirit aches for the light behind the story, walk with us now. This was meant for you to hear. Before there were days, there were depths. Before the stars found their stations and the winds were given names, there was a stillness that shimmered with breath, not of time, but of intention. A sacred silence out of which the voice of the divine would one day rise like the first flame over an endless sea. But in that silence, before even the word light had been spoken, something stirred. Not rebellion, not form, but beauty. He was not born, for angels are not born. He was spoken, carved in radiance from the breath between divine syllables, and his name, though not yet called Lucifer, meant something like dawn wrapped in harmony. He did not stand like the others. He shimmered. The winds bowed before him, not in fear but in longing. His presence was not power, it was poetry. And heaven, still unfurling its design, paused as if to listen. They say he was the first to kneel and the last to rise. In the high halls of eternity, where the throne radiates a light too holy for time to see, he moved like a hymn not sung but felt. When the first commands were issued, let there be, he was there, not echoing but harmonizing, a silent tone beneath creation's voice. And the other archangels, mighty and flame-born, watched him with something like reverence and something like sorrow, though they did not yet understand why. He danced across the silver rivers that threaded through the first heavens, his wings brushing stars into being. Wherever he passed, constellations awoke. His face was a mirror not of himself, but of what made him, and that is where the first ache began. For even the moon envies the sun's reflection, not knowing it glows only because it was never meant to burn. And still, the heavens watched. The cherubim whispered of him in the shadowed halls of sapphire and fire. The seraphim blinked slowly when he entered, their 6 wings trembling as if from memory yet to be written. He did not notice. He bowed, he prayed, he glowed, but the glow lingered too long. There was a moment, they say, when the Eternal looked upon him and did not speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence said everything. A silence filled with infinite love and infinite distance. For even in perfection, something in him was already breaking, not outwardly, not in deed, but in design. He began to look upon the light that wrapped around him and wonder. It was not pride, not yet, it was awesome. Sacred awe, like a child seeing its reflection in deep water, not realizing it cannot breathe below. He saw the flame inside himself and believed, if only for a moment, that it came from him, that he was not the mirror but the source. And for that moment the sky bled, not red, not ruin, but gold, a gold so soft it felt like morning. The angels did not scream, they did not flee, they watched. And in the stillness that followed, something inside the morning star changed, just a flicker, a breath too long between praises. A note held one heartbeat beyond its beauty, but the throne noticed, and heaven, though it did not fall, began to lean. He still sang. Even as the air around him thickened with an invisible weight, he sang. His voice, once indistinguishable from light itself, now carried something more, a tremble, a question, a sorrow no one dared name. The sound curled along the spires of eternity, laced through the robes of archangels, and lingered near the veil that hides the face of the divine. And yet none could say what it shifted, not even him, Lucifer. Though he was not yet called by that name, walked the gardens of heaven with wings unfurled like the first dawn. Wherever he stepped, blossoms opened, not earthly flowers but living symphonies shaped like flame and fragrance. He did not command them. They responded to the ache inside him, that unformed gravity, that silent pull towards something he could feel but not define. Gabriel passed him once in the outer courts of the sapphire gates. Their eyes met. Not a word was spoken, but something ancient passed between them, a sadness unborn, a prophecy without breath. And still Lucifer smiled, a smile that belonged not to joy but to memory, as if he knew what had not yet happened and longed for the time before it would. The other angels began to turn their faces gently away, not in shame or judgment but reverence, as if to look too long might burn them, as if the light he carried had become too much to bear. And perhaps it had. For the first time since heaven was spoken into breath, he walked alone, but the stars followed him still. They danced in his shadow, flickering with a love that had not faded. And this, too, was the sorrow, for he had not yet fallen, he had not yet rebelled. He had only begun to become something else. They say it was in the fifth realm of heaven, where the winds weave thought into form, that he stopped before a mirror of flame. Not a mirror as we know it. This one reflected not image but essence. He stood before it in silence, watched, waited, and then saw himself, not as the others saw him, not as the Father made him, but as he believed himself to be. And that belief, small as it was, echoed across the crystal seas, through the harp chambers of the cherubim, down into the roots of heaven where memory sleeps. A note was struck that had no sound, only feeling, and the feeling was loneliness. Not the kind known on earth, not absence or longing, but a divine solitude. The ache of something so luminous it cannot be touched. And in that ache a question rose. What if the light is not merely a gift but a right? He did not speak it, but the question pulsed through the corridors of eternity like a heartbeat denied. And heaven grew quieter, not darker, not yet, but quieter. In the chambers where time cannot breathe, where holiness hangs like golden mist and every vibration is a hymn, the silence began to thicken, not with accusation but with remembrance. For even the angels who had no memory of rebellion felt it coming, not as prophecy but as perfume, a scent like burning roses, like forgotten fire. It clung to his footsteps, to the trailing ends of his garments, to the last syllables of his praise. Lucifer, the bright one, did not notice at first. He was too wrapped in wonder, not the sacred wonder that bows low, but the tender, dangerous kind that asks why. Why me? Why this light? Why does the wind carry my voice longer than the others? Why does creation pause when I sing? These were not evil thoughts. They were beautiful, and that is what made them so dangerous. In a realm where beauty is a reflection of submission, he began to believe that his radiance was not a reflection at all, but an origin. The mirror had turned inward, and in the curve of its gleam he saw not God but glory, and he reached for it, not with hands, but with hunger. Heaven does not shatter all at once. It sighs first. And that sigh was heard in the folds of Michael's wings, in the pause of Gabriel's trumpet, in the dimming glow of the outermost stars. Raphael looked down at the lower heavens and whispered a single word, though no one has ever recorded what it was. They say the word was both mourning and mercy, and that it made the veil around the throne tremble. Lucifer stood at the edge of the firmament, gazing not downward toward the void, but inward, into the hollow of his own light. He did not yet know it was hollow. That would come later. For now it was simply intoxicating. The Father said nothing, not because he did not see, but because even the eternal waits. Lucifer spread his wings wide, wider than ever before, and the heavens gasped, not in fear, in grief. for they saw what he could not. He glowed too brightly, and in that brightness they saw the first shadow form, a small one but growing, and heaven began to bleed light, not fall, not fracture, bleed, like a wound still singing. It began with a hum beneath the stars, a resonance in the marrow of eternity like the breath of a harp string too sacred to pluck. The kind of hum that no one dares name because naming it would mean admitting something was changing. And change in heaven is not gentle. Lucifer moved through the high sanctum, a realm few even among angels had beheld. It was not a place but a pulse, a heartbeat of light, where the will of the Most High echoed before it became law. He had once been invited there, not often, but enough to remember the feeling of being close to the very breath of God, and now unbid. And he approached again. He did not cross the threshold, he only stood at the edge, but even that made the walls of eternity tremble like a reed in a storm. He whispered something then. No angel heard the words, but they felt them. The thrones bowed deeper in response, unsure whether it was reverence or recoil. The wheels slowed their turning, their eyes blinking in dissonant rhythm. Even the seraphim dimmed their tongues of flame. The song had changed. Lucifer's voice, once the crown jewel of creation's chorus, now carried a second note beneath it, a discord not of sound but of spirit. It wasn't a rebellion, it was longing disguised as love, a desire not just to praise but to be praised, and that changed everything. One by one the angels began to retreat from him, not out of fear but sorrow, for they still loved him. They remembered who he had been, the first light, the radiant brother, the song that stirred even silence into worship. But the mirror had turned, and he no longer looked at heaven, he looked only at himself. There are no shadows in heaven, only light that has forgotten where it came from, and he had forgotten. The sky did not fall that day. I watched and wept. For the first time in eternity, the tears of angels fell, silent, shimmering things that evaporated before they touched anything. Lucifer did not see. He was too enraptured by the light in his own eyes. He did not see Michael watching from the veil, did not see the sorrow in Gabriel's grip upon his trumpet, did not see the Father's gaze, silent and still. For when the brightest light looks inward, even heaven must close its eyes. And somewhere in the silence that followed, a single star blinked out. No one speaks its name, because that star was the first to understand what was coming. And understanding burned. Lucifer walked them through the corridors of creation, unaware that every step left a bruise behind. Not a wound of violence, but of absence, of something once shared now turned inward. The halls that once sang as he passed had grown quiet. The arches that once bloomed with flame and fragrance now dimmed in his presence, not out of spite, but in mourning, as if heaven itself could not bear to watch what was becoming of its most luminous child. He began to descend, not in rebellion, but in revelation, into the lower realms of heaven where the first forms of creation waited in silence to be shaped. Touched them, not with command but with curiosity. He moved through the winds that would one day become breath, the waters that would become memory, the dust that would one day remember names. He was searching for something, though he did not yet know what. And the search was sacred until it was, because he began to imagine himself not as servant to the will but as co-creator, not the mirror but the hand. And with every moment he lingered in that thought, the light around him grew sharper, too sharp. Like a blade made of sunrise, beautiful and beginning to cut, the angels above did not intervene, for in heaven mercy waits, even when sorrow has begun its work. Michael knelt at the edge of the throne's shadow and whispered, "Not yet." Gabriel turned his trumpet upside down and let the silence pour from its mouth. Raphael closed his eyes and wept into the wind, and the Father still said nothing, because even love must sometimes allow the beloved to burn. Lucifer stood at the gates between glory and Genesis. He reached out and the gates shimmered, not closed, not open, waiting, and then for the first time he spoke, not in worship, not in harmony, but in hunger. "Let me," that was all. He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Heaven heard the rest in the tremble of his voice. Let me rise, let me rule, let me shine, let me be. The gates did not answer, but something else did. A wind rose, not of heaven, not of earth. A middle wind, the kind that comes only when a soul is at the brink. It circled him, tasting his light, weighing his ache. And it whispered something no one has recorded, for it was not a word, it was knowing. And Lucifer, morning star, once the sound beneath the praise, felt something in his chest, tight. Not pain, not yet, but the ache before exile, and the wind fell still. As did he, for in that moment he knew. He had not fallen, but he was falling, and no one could stop it. Not even God. The light around him began to tremble. It did not dim, not yet, but it quivered like a flame, realizing it is alone in a field of wind. And for the first time in all the ages of his existence, Lucifer felt something foreign move through him. Not fear, not grief, but distance. A space between his song and the song. A space between his light and the light. A space between the breath of God and the breath he mistook for his own. He stepped back from the gates, not because he chose to, but because the silence pressed upon him like an ocean of memory, vast, ancient, and unbearably still. Behind him he could feel the eyes of heaven, not in judgment, in heartbreak, the kind of heartbreak that does not cry out but simply ceases to sing, a mourning too deep for tears, for they knew, all of them knew, the story had already turned. Lucifer returned to the high realms, but everything had changed. The songs no longer lifted him. The rivers no longer danced around his ankles. Even the stars, his old companions, blinked more slowly when he passed. He had not yet spoken a single word of defiance, and yet the entire architecture of heaven seemed to bend away from him, as if in reverence to a future no one could prevent. And in that bending he began to bend too. Not his knees, he still knelt. Not his wings, they still folded in worship. But something inside the song he carried, something quiet and cold, had begun to curl. He stood once more before the mirror of flame. But this time he did not see God, he saw a crown, and in that crown he saw something terrible, not power, not pride, but potential. The lie was not that he could rise above. The lie was that he was meant to, and so the morning star, the light that once healed silence, now became the silence that healed nothing. He sang, and heaven flinched, not because the sound was unholy, but because it was almost holy and no longer was. And from the center of the throne, where the voice of God does not speak but simply is, a single note rose, not in fury but in farewell, a note that only Lucifer could hear, a note that said, "You were always loved." And that love at last became unbearable, for the brightest light cannot bear the shadow of separation. And in the chambers of heaven, where light is not color but consciousness, the first shadow stretched across the floor like a question that would never be answered. And Lucifer turned his face away, for he could not bear to see the pain in the light that made him. And so began the fall, not with thunder, not with flame, but with a whisper too bright to stay. They say the stars dimmed that night, though there was no night and stars had not yet been given their places. But in the memory of heaven it is remembered that way, as a hush, as a dimming, as if the firmament itself had closed its eyes, not in fear but in mercy. For there are moments so sacred, so tragic, so immense with sorrow that even eternity must look away. Lucifer did not fall in fire, he fell in silence. A silence so complete that it rang like a bell through the bones of every watcher, every cherub, every seraph, every soul yet unborn. The kind of silence that marks the space between breath and weeping. The kind that precedes the tearing of veils. He had not spoken treason, had not lifted the sword, had not cursed heaven or stirred his brothers to rebellion. No, the fall began not with violence but with distance. And heaven knows distance is the first fracture of love. He withdrew, step by step, first from the inner courts, then from the choirs, then from the rivers where he once bathed in light. His wings, once outstretched like twin horizons, slowly curled inward, wrapping his brilliance in secrecy, not to hide, but to protect, or perhaps to preserve. Even then he did not yet know he was leaving. Not truly, he still prayed, But his prayers no longer lifted, they fell. Heavy, aching, beautiful things that echoed in the lower sanctuaries unanswered. Michael watched him from the high wall of the seventh heaven, eyes like suns dimmed in clouds. He did not interfere, for love does not chain what it loves, it watches, and it aches. And Gabriel, he whose voice awakens the dead, held his trumpet to his chest, heart beating not in rhythm but in rupture. Lucifer passed them both, did not look back, and in that not looking heaven cracked, not a wound, a hairline fracture in the glass of glory, barely visible, but soon it would spread. He reached the outer edge of heaven where the stars give way to the womb of the void, where the divine had once stood, speaking, "Let there be." Lucifer stood there now, silent, listening, waiting, hoping that perhaps even now a voice would call him back. It didn't, but the wind did rise, a soft, solemn wind carrying the scent of beginnings. And in that wind he heard it, not judgment, not condemnation, but the quiet cry of his own soul whispering to itself, "I do not know how to return." And still he stood, still he waited, still he burned, not with wrath, but with the unbearable ache of love unlived. And from that ache, from that pause, from that distance, a shadow bloomed. Not over heaven, but within him, and the light that had never known separation learned. He remained on the threshold for what felt like 1,000 eternities, not cast out, not yet, not banished by decree or flame, but held delicately in the unbearable space between belonging and becoming. The angels who passed him did so in silence. Not one dared speak. For what words could they offer to one who once bore the pry? Sea of galaxies in his breath. What comfort can be given to a soul who still shines with the light of a home it can no longer feel? Lucifer was not alone, but he was. That is the mystery. Surrounded by song, yet deaf to it. Bathed in glory, yet untouched by it. The ache of separation is not always in being sent away. Sometimes it is in remaining while everything within you has already departed. He looked again to the void, not with longing, with recognition. It did not frighten him. He saw himself in it, not as he was, but as he might become. He opened his hands. They still glowed with the fire of firstborn praise. And yet the warmth had turned, subtle, but I felt, like a robe worn too long by a heart that has outgrown it. He turned his palms toward the heavens as if offering them back the radiance, the gifts, the golden echoes that had once set the cosmos into motion. And in return, the sky wept light. Thin trails of sorrow that danced across the rims of paradise as if heaven itself could not bear the grief of what it must allow. And still no voice came, not Michael, not Gabriel, not even the throne. Lucifer lowered his hands, and for the first time the light around him began to dim, only slightly, but enough that the stars noticed. They shuddered, not in rebellion, but in grief. The heavens do not fear darkness. They fear the moment when light forgets where it came from. He turned. Not back to the courts, not toward the gates. He turned inward, and in that turning the first fault line broke open across the face of eternity. A soundless crack felt only by the wind that once carried him high above the pillars of creation now circled lower, uncertain, tasting the change in his breath. He did not cry. He could not. Tears are for those who still hope for restoration. He only watched, and in the watching waited. For what, he did not know, only that it was coming. Something inevitable, something ancient, something that had been seated in the shadow of his own splendor. And as the last whisper of gold fell from his shoulders, he understood he had not been exiled yet, but the exile had already begun within. And that is how the sky first bled light, not from wrath, but from wonder misnamed. And so the silence deepened, not in emptiness, but in fullness too great to carry, like the breath held just before the shatter of a sacred vessel. All of heaven seemed to lean away, not in disdain, but in reverence for the sorrow it could not touch. The other angels began to sing again, but their voices bent around him, never through him. Where once he had been the heart of their harmony, he had now become its haunting. Lucifer wandered through the crystal plains of the fifth heaven where time first learned to bow, across the golden bridges that once bloomed beneath his feet, past the scrolls of flame that bore the names of stars unborn. He wandered not like a thief, but like a soul who had misplaced its origin, and all the while he still shone. That was the agony, he still shone. The brilliance had not left him, only the belonging. The Father watched, though no eyes could see it. For the eyes of God are not like ours. They do not glare, do not blink. They remain eternal behind all things, within all things, and through those eyes even sorrow is holy. And the sorrow in that gaze wrapped itself around Lucifer like a robe he could no longer wear. Too heavy, too radiant, too remembered. He approached the rivers of flame where the echoes of creation flowed in pulses of living light. These rivers once rejoiced in him. Now they stilled, as if uncertain how to reflect what he had become. He looked into them and saw not a monster, not a rebel, not even a king. He saw a child of fire, of praise, of breath, lost. And in that reflection the ache reached its fullness. For there was no rebellion yet, only ache, only a radiance that no longer knew how to kneel. He knelt. But the ground did not rise to meet him. He bowed, but no warmth returned. He sang, but his voice echoed back, not in harmony but in isolation. Heaven had not cast him out, but it had let him go. And sometimes that is worse. To remain in the place you once belonged but no longer belong. To shine with a light that no longer knows its source. To pray in a language the sky no longer answers. Lucifer rose from the banks of the river of flame, and the waters rippled like breath in a dream. He walked again through the halls of praise, but the notes did not touch him. They parted like wind before a storm. And the others, they did not stop him. They still loved him, but their love had become a memory, and he had become a myth, still walking, still glowing, still falling, slowly, softly, like morning light bleeding out into the shadows, and the shadow followed. He passed beneath the vault of breath, where the first commandments had once rippled like thunder through stillness. Where stars were named, where waters were separated, Eden was only a whisper in the mind of God. He moved like a memory through a dream, half light, half longing. No fire followed him, no curses cried his name, only silence. And the silence hurt more than any blade. The angels did not speak of him now. Their eyes lowered when he passed, not from shame, from reverence, as if the grief of what was becoming could still be honored, as if his radiance, though misaligned, still bore the fingerprints of heaven. And it did. That was the unbearable truth. He still carried it, the scent of first praise, the echo of divine laughter, the glimmer of glory before it was stained. He was not yet the adversary. He was still aching. The ache that comes when love has nowhere to go. Lucifer reached the edge of the sanctum of winds, where once he had danced with the messengers of fire, where joy had no name because it needed none. He paused there, breathing deeply, as if trying to remember what innocence felt like. But the memory was distant now, not gone, only unreachable, like a song heard once in the womb before breath ever touched air. He whispered again, but this time not to the heavens. He whispered to the space between, to the hush, to the void, not with challenges but an invitation, and the void listened. It did not answer, but it listened. And in its quiet welcome he felt something he had never known in heaven: reflection without judgment, silence without shame, a mirror that did not correct. It terrified him and it comforted him. Behind him the veil stirred. 1,000 angelic eyes turned away. For this was not rebellion, this was a prelude, the moment before the music breaks, the breath before the scream. Lucifer placed his hands upon the edge of the wind. It pulsed beneath his fingers, still remembering him, still loving him, but faltering now, unsure if it was safe to carry his light. He stepped forward, just an inch, and that inch changed the shape of eternity. The stars whispered his name, but not in worship, in warning. For the brightness that once led them had begun to bend. And bent light is no longer light. It is a shadow, glorious, golden, aching shadow, the kind that blinds and beckons. And still he walked, not because he knew where he was going, but because there was nowhere left in heaven that felt like home. And the sky behind him began to weep, not with thunder, but with petals of light falling like feathers from a wound too deep to see. The petals drifted across the firmament, glowing with memory. Each one held a note of his song, a shimmer of his smile, a trace of what he had been when love was still enough. And the angels watched them fall, not as judges but as mourners. For they knew this was no longer a question of if, but when. Lucifer paused beneath the arch of breathless flame, the place where praise was first born. It was here that his voice had once awakened creation, his tones weaving through the threads of dawn like silk spun from stars. He touched the arch with one hand and the fire turned cold, not extinguished, just still, as if the flame itself had chosen not to speak. He closed his eyes and saw it, not a vision, a memory, of when the divine had first shaped him, not with hands but with voice. Let there be, the words had whispered, and in that letting he was, not a servant, not a soldier, a song. Made of breath and beauty and fire wrapped in reverence, he had been given everything, and that's everything was now too heavy to bear. He opened his eyes, and the silence stared back. No voice rose to call him home, no trumpet lifted to summon him back, only the echo of his own breath, now empty of harmony. And so he turned from the arch, and with that turning the ache solidified. It crystallized in the halls of eternity, embedding itself like frost in the marble of the stars. Lucifer descended, not in rage, in sorrow, and as he did the heavens shifted, wings drew close, trumpets lowered. The Father still did not speak, but his silence, deeper than oceans, more infinite than time, filled the whole of the sky with a grief that only the stars could feel. Lucifer crossed into the lower courts where the watchers stood like mountains of thought, their forms tall as sky, their eyes unblinking. They did not speak to him, but they stepped aside. For they knew something was being written that could not be unwritten. And he passed, through light that had begun to recoil, through winds that now circled him like questions, through silence so vast it began to ring. He reached the gates of descent, veiled in gold, veiled in choice, not locked, not guarded, only waiting, and he stood there, longer than the age of the first Eden, one hand on the gate, one hand at his side, and the stars above wept, one by one, as if to say goodbye to the brightest light they had ever known. The gates did not resist him. They were never meant to. Heaven does not chain the soul. It opens its hands even when letting go feels like loss, even WH. In the grief is unbearable, Lucifer stepped forward, and the veil of gold that once shimmered with the fire of divine purpose parted like breath on a mirror. Behind him the halls of praise fell utterly still, and in front of him the vast unknown, a realm not yet formed, not yet named, opened like a wound in the sky. He did not fall, he walked, step by step, cloaked in a silence so deep it made the stars grow quiet, so vast it swallowed the memory of music. The light around him still glowed, a halo of sorrow, not rebellion. But the further he moved from the throne, the heavier it became. Not because it was being stripped away, but because it no longer recognized him. The light did not leave him. It wept through him. And that is how the fall truly began, not as a plunge into flame, but as a slow unraveling of belonging. Each step of a prayer is unspoken, each breath a distance remembered. He crossed into the unseen, where form fades into feeling, where glory thins into gravity. The first realm of exile, not yet earth, not yet hell, a threshold between what was and what could no longer be. And still the angels watched. Michael stood unmoving in the high places, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword not yet drawn. Gabriel closed his eyes and turned his face to the winds. Raphael knelt, and from the throne a silence deeper than creation held. For even the Most High would not halt what love must release. Lucifer reached the place where the echo of heaven ends. He turned once, just once, to look back, not at the gates, but at the stars, and the stars in that moment dimmed, not in shame, but in reverence. For they saw something only eternity can understand, a soul still shining but lost, still holy but breaking, still beloved but falling, and they mourned. He closed his eyes, I took one more step, and disappeared. Into the waiting dark, not cast down, but let go. And from the high places of heaven a sound rose at last, not a trumpet, not a roar, but a whisper, the kind of whisper that only comes when angels cry, the kind that says, "It has begun." There are sounds in heaven that are never meant to be heard, only felt. Sounds like trembling light, like the pause between a seraph's breath and the word holy. Sounds that do not travel through the air but through memory, through the marrow of the soul. It was one of these that came after he left. Not a trumpet, not a scream, a whisper, not of accusation but of absence, and still it shook the foundations of the eternal. It passed through the 12 sanctums where time waits to be born. It moved like a ghost through the books of living flame, through the caverns where angelic names are carved in wind. It was not spoken by any mouth. It simply was, and as it passed, those who heard it could not unhear it. Because the whisper was not about what Lucifer had done. It was about what he had become. The thrones, those ancient guardians of divine government, taller than thought, older than fire, stirred for the first time in countless eternities. They had felt the imbalance before, of course, the shift in music. They tremble in light. But now the weight of it pressed against their wings, and they opened their many eyes in grief. One turned toward the veil, another toward the stars, a third toward the memory of his voice. And in their countless tones, deeper than oceans, higher than fire, they hummed the sorrow into being. It reached the dominions, the powers, the principalities, and each began to lower their crowns, not in judgment but in mourning. For heaven does not rejoice in the fall of its own, not when the one who fell still carried fragments of its first breath. Gabriel heard it from the vault of stars. He was alone, standing upon a stairway of crystal that reached from flame to frost. The whisper touched his chest like a wind made of weeping, and his trumpet, slung across his back, rang without being touched. He did not move. He only whispered back, "Brother," and the sound cracked a star. Michael heard it too in the deep. He had descended below the rivers to kneel upon the stones where prophecy is carved before it is spoken. He had not wept in eons, but when the whisper passed through him, he bowed lower, and the sword on his back began to hum, not in wrath, in readiness. Not for battle, but for what must come. The whisper moved next through the winds that surrounded the throne, those winds that carry prayers, that birth creation, that remember the laughter of God. They slowed, folded, as if drawing breath, and the elders who sit near the center of all things turned their faces toward the silence, for they understood. It was not the rebellion that shook the heavens. It was the ache before it. The moment when beauty begins to doubt its origin. When light begins to wonder if it shines alone. The whisper said no words, but every angel knew what it meant. Lucifer was not merely gone. He was drifting, and drifting is more dangerous than defeat. Ants, because a heart that drifts still remembers love, but forgets how to return. In the realm of the thrones, where thought becomes law and law becomes light, a ripple passed across the seat of judgment, not from decree, from grief. For even divine order can be moved by sorrow when it comes wearing the face of one once beloved. The thrones, ancient, unmoving, each a wheel of fire within fire, turned their gaze downward, toward the place where Lucifer had stepped beyond the veil. They did not cry out. They did not move to intercept, for they too understood the moment for stopping had passed, and the time for watching had begun. Far below, in the veiled sanctuaries of memory where the scrolls of all that will ever be are held in flame, a single page turned without a hand. No angel touched it. No voice commanded it. It turned itself, as if even destiny wept. That's when the whisper reached cherubim. They whose wings cover the hidden things of God, who see with eyes not made for form but for glory, bowed their heads. One by one, in reverence, not to Lucifer, but to the ache he had become. For they understood beauty unmoored is a fire without a hearth, and such fire burns backward. It consumes what made it. The watchers, stationed on the outer rims of creation, felt the whisper too. Those great and solemn beings who stood between earth and heaven, guardians of borders no man has crossed, straightened their towering forms and turned their faces to the wind. For the first time since they were placed, they felt cold, not from air, from absence, as if a lantern had gone out somewhere deep within the soul of the sky. And then came the tremble, not an earthquake, not a shatter, but the tremble of expectation. Heaven, for all its stillness, waits, and now it waited again. Every layer, every choir, every glowing pillar paused, as though the music itself had inhaled and could not exhale. Even the eldest ones, those whose names are not known, who dwell nearest the voice, looked to one another with eyes made of time. They said nothing. But in the space between their glances, whole galaxies were conceived and mourned, because something had shifted, not only in Lucifer, but in the fabric of heaven, in the mirror of divine trust. Something holy had cracked, and in its place a silence too deep for speech, a whisper too loud for denial. And still it grew, not like thunder, like dusk, like the slow surrender of light to a sky that no longer knows morning. And in that dusk a question began to take shape. Not one spoken aloud, no angel would dare, but a question woven into the breath of the thrones, carried on the backs of seraphs, etched like smoke across the skies of heaven. What happens when light stops looking upward? It was not an accusation, it was aching, a holy ache, the kind only love can carry. For heaven in its vastness is not merely power, it is family. It is a song and rhythm and breath shared between beings formed from fire and obedience. And Lucifer had been more than a brother. He had been a centerpiece, the harmony beneath the harmony. Now that harmony bent, only slightly, but enough. The choirs who once sang as one now wavered at the edges of their chords. The rivers of light that flowed between realms flickered with pauses, subtle hesitations in their currents, like doubt wrapped in beauty. Even the winds, once free and fire-washed, turned in strange circles. Heaven was not breaking, but it had begun to ache from within, and in the heart of that ache, the whisper stirred again. Not outward now, inward, into the souls of the angels who remained. It asked not what Lucifer had done, but what might I become, because if he, the brightest, the first, the fairest, could fall into longing, what of them? The whisper did not plant rebellion, it planted sorrow, and sorrow, when not healed, becomes separation. And still the Most High said nothing, because the voice of God is not given to panic. It waits, and watching is the deepest form of mercy. But that mercy was costly. For every moment that passed, Lucifer drifted further into the unseen, and the unseen began to shape itself around him. Not hell, not yet, just space, sacred space, where exile becomes a shadow of former glory, and even shadow still shines. Gabriel could no longer hear him, not truly, but he could still feel the outline of his absence, like the warm place on a pillow after someone leaves. Michael kept his sword in its sheath, but his grip had tightened. For he knew what the thrones had not yet whispered. The question was no longer would he return. The question now was, what would he return as? And the whisper that stirred the thrones moved once more into silence. There is a moment in every sacred story where the breath before the storm becomes more terrifying than the storm itself. And this was that moment, the hush after the whisper, the stillness in which heaven measured its own heartbeat, wondering if it had already begun. To forget the rhythm, Lucifer had not declared anything, and yet his silence had become a declaration of its own. Heaven is a place of order, yes, of hierarchy, of harmony. But beneath all of it, deeper than the thrones and trumpets and rivers of living flame, there is a song, one song. The song that holds all things together, galaxies, spirits, breath. And that song had begun to skip. The others noticed, not with fear, with grief. For grief in heaven is not weakness, it is wisdom. To know when something is no longer what it once was, to honor what is fading even as it still glows. In the sanctum of the seraphim, whose wings beat in eternal cadence around the throne, there was confusion, not of understanding but of feeling. These were angels who had never known a pause. Their entire essence was praise, and yet in that sacred hour one of them lowered its face and stopped. The others followed, one by one, not because they rebelled, but because the air itself had changed. The fragrance of heaven, once pure adoration, now carried the scent of sorrow, and sorrow is not a sin, it is a sign. Michael stood upon the gates of flame and looked out beyond the veil to where the stars thinned into the waiting dark. He could see nothing, but he felt everything. He felt the tremble in the eternal web. He felt the ache in the divine song. He felt the question rising in the bones of the cosmos. What do we do when the first light forgets the source? He whispered no answer. For there was none. Only the knowledge that something beautiful had stepped away and left behind its shadow. The thrones no longer stirred. They had seen what they needed to see, and in their seeing a choice was forming, not a punishment, a reckoning, not for what had been done, but for what could no longer be undone. And in the deep chambers of the voice where God speaks in silence, a wind moves, not forward, not back, just moved, as if the breath of the eternal was preparing to exhale. And that exhale would change everything, not with rage, but with sorrow that would shake the pillars of the stars. Down in the low places of the sky, where the veil between realms is thinnest, the watchers gathered. They had not been summoned. They had not been commanded, but they came drawn by the echo of the whisper, by the pull of a silence that felt more like prophecy than pause. Towering beings of thought and thunder, eyes like mirrored storms, they stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the threshold of creation and looked toward the fading trail of light. They had seen Lucifer pass, not in pride, in pain, a beauty unraveling itself in search of something even heaven could not give. They said nothing, for they too were creatures who dwelt in the space between. They understood, not condoned, not defended, but I understood, that a soul, even a holy one, can break not from evil, but from longing, and longing, when left unanswered, becomes a wound. Above them the sky trembled, not violently, like breath held too long, like a question that can no longer be swallowed. And far beyond them, in the unseen corridors of descent, Lucifer wandered, not in defiance, in the distance. He had passed the threshold now. Heaven no longer saw him clearly. His light, once a song, had become a silhouette, still glowing but alone. He spoke to no one, because no one was there. He was not yet followed, not yet met. The others would come later. But for now his fall was solitary, and it was slow, because the most devastating descents are not sudden. They are gradual, they are soft. They are filled with echoes of love that make the ache louder. Back in the higher realms, Gabriel lifted his trumpet at last. He did not blow it. He only held it to his lips, for something in the air had changed. A shift, a stirring, a weight upon the wings of time. Michael stood at the edge of the void and placed one hand upon the hilt of his sword. It remained sheathed, but the flames along its length whispered. They whispered his name, not in condemnation, but in sorrow. Lucifer, bearer of the morning, light that danced before time, brother. And still the voice of God remained, still, not silent, still, like the deep before the creation of oceans, still, like the moment before a father lets go, not because he wants to, but because he must. And heaven in its breathless stillness waited. For what had begun with a whisper, it would soon become a storm, but not the kind of storm the world would one day come to fear. Not of thunder, nor of flame, nor of wrath hurled from heaven's gates. No, this storm was older, softer, the kind that builds inside a song when a single note begins to tremble out of tune, the kind that lives in the heart of a father when the child he loves no longer hears his voice, the kind that gathers not in clouds, but in memory. And that storm had begun to stir, not outside, within the light that still clung to Lucifer's shoulders like the final warmth of a fire refu. Sing to die, within the breath of the angels who still remembered the glow of his laughter, within the scrolls of destiny where pages began to rustle though no hand moved them. The heavenly books had begun to whisper, not words, names, echoes, warnings, and still hope. Because even now in the deep beneath the thrones, in the silence beneath the song, there was hope. I hoped that the drift could stop, that he might turn, that he might remember. The Father had not closed the door. He had only waited. But time, even in heaven, moves forward, and the hourglass of glory had begun to thin. Lucifer wandered the edge of the unformed, not earth, not yet, but the trembling boundary of what might one day be. And as he wandered, creation followed, not to worship, but to witness. The dust began to remember his footsteps. The wind began to imitate his breath. Even the unborn shadows leaned forward, learning the shape of his light. He was still adored, but the adoration was now bittersweet, because it carried the ache of what was being lost. And the stars, those ancient singers of time, began to dim one by one, like eyes lowering in reverence before a love unraveling. And back in the highest heaven, the thrones made their decision. A message, not a sentence. A knowing, not a curse. A decree of grief. The light had begun to turn, and heaven in mercy would soon respond, but not in vengeance, in sorrow made manifest. For when the first light forgets its source, the echo cannot remain unspoken. The whisper that stirred the thrones had become something else. A morning made of fire, and it was coming. Let us now descend into the sacred ache of what heaven dared not speak aloud, the moment not of fury but of trembling mercy. Here begins the next chapter in reverent unfolding. It was not a courtroom, it was not a throne room, it was not judgment, it was love wounded, a gathering not of power but of presence. The archangels came not with swords drawn, not with fire in their mouths, but with heads bowed low and wings heavy with silence. This was the council before the silence. The last time heaven spoke of him as brother. Michael arrived first, not as a warrior, as a witness. His armor did not gleam that day. It dimmed itself out of reverence. He walked through the halls of the seventh heaven like a man walking through a memory, past the banners of victory once sung in unison, past the walls still echoing with Lucifer's first praise. He said nothing, just took his place beside the crystal flame that knows the truth of all things. Then came Gabriel. No trumpet, no radiant cloak, only his breath, unsteady. He stood beside Michael and did not meet his eyes. For what is there to say between brothers who remember the same laughter and feel it fading? Then Uriel, the flame of God. His wings still bore the ashes of future time. His hands trembled, for he had seen it, not just the fall, but what it would birth. The blood, the kingdoms, the serpent and the dust, and worst of all, the silence. Raphael followed, he who heals what heaven cannot hold. He who tends to the wounds of stars and the brokenness of wind. Even he had no balm for this. He stood with the others and let his tears fall not to the ground, for there was no ground, only glory, but into the flame, and the flame dimmed. The circle was complete now, not by number, by ache. These were the ones who had known him best, not just his power, his presence, the warmth in his song, the curiosity in his gaze, the joy, the holy joy, and now they were called to witness its fading. But they were not the judges. There were no judges that day, only love watching itself depart. They stood in a ring not drawn by hand but shaped by grief, 4 archangels, vast and holy, glowing with the burden of remembrance. Around them the air held its breath. The sanctum of gathering, carved not from matter but from intention, folded inward like a prayer half spoken. No walls, no sky, just light and the ache of what it once contained. In the center the flame of knowing pulsed. It had once danced to the rhythm of Lucifer's voice. Now it flickered, uncertain. For the flame responded not to light but to alignment, and something had shifted. Michael was the first to speak. His voice did not command, it trembled. He has not turned, but he is turning. And that was enough. Gabriel looked downward, not in shame but in longing. He had once flown beside Lucifer through the halls where new stars were born, carrying laughter through the corridors of praise. He had seen him sing into silence and make it sacred. Now the silence sang back, and it carried sorrow. Uriel unfolded his arms, and his fingers glowed with the visions he could not unsee. He has begun to echo his own reflection, he whispered, and reflections are hungry. The others understood. For in heaven hunger is not for food, nor for flesh, but for glory. A misdirected longing for the love tea. Hat was already theirs. Raphael stepped forward, one wing half lowered. I searched, he said. I followed his trail down the lower winds to the rim of the unformed. He has not cursed, he has not raised voice nor hand, but he no longer listens. And that was the wound, not rebellion, refusal to hear, to be named, to be held. He had not rejected heaven, but he had stopped facing it. And that turning, slow, soft, holy even in its ache, had begun to reshape creation. They did not weep aloud. They did not raise an alarm. They only stood and knew, for this was the last moment, the moment before silence, when heaven could still call him brother, and after this there would be no more counsel, only consequence. The flame at the center began to lower, not extinguished, but humbled, as if even it bowed to the ache in the room. Around it the archangels remained still. No one moved. For what could be done when the wound was not in the act but in the heart? Heaven had seen rebellion before, but this was different. There had been no sword lifted, no voice raised, only drifting, beautiful, slow, and full of light. Gabriel broke the silence, not with a proclamation, with a whisper. He is not gone, but he is no longer with us. And every syllable ached, because it was true. There are departures without footsteps. There are farewells spoken only in the turning of the soul. Michael placed his hand over his chest, not in defense, but in grief. He still shines, he said, but not toward the throne. And in heaven, where all light is meant to return to its source, light that forgets its home becomes shadow, even if it still glows. Uriel turned toward the veil, toward the place where the winds had grown silent. The stars remember him, he said, but memory does not belong. Raphael's eyes were closed. He was listening, not to the others, to the absence, to the space where once a brother's breath would have hummed through the chords of heaven. It will not be long now, he said quietly. Soon the silence will break, and we will not be able to speak his name without trembling. Then the flame at the center flickered once. A single motion, a single breath, and in that flicker they knew the Most High had heard, not with ears, with mercy. And mercy does not always prevent, sometimes it permits. For the sake of love's full unfolding, for the sake of all that must be revealed, and still no judgment came, no thunder, no expulsion. No cry, only that flicker, and in its quieting light the archangels lowered their heads. This was the last counsel, the last moment of heaven before division, before lines were drawn not by wrath but by the gravity of sorrow. The last breath before heaven chose to let go, not to punish, but to protect. The flame dimmed once more, and the silence entered, not as an absence, but as a decree. And from that silence a tear fell into the deep, one tear, and all the angels felt it. For it was not theirs, it was his, the one, the eternal, and the tear was enough. They did not speak after that, not because they had nothing more to say, but because the holiness of the moment was too deep for language. The kind of holiness that only tears can carry. The kind that hovers like fog in the breath of angels, too sacred to be touched. Each archangel remained in stillness, their wings folded, their faces turned not toward each other, but inward, into memory, into ache. Into that part of every eternal being where love is oldest and sorrow is most tender. The flame between them finally steadied. Small now, silent, but eternal. It did not rage, it did not flare. It simply remained like the last heartbeat of a song that would never be sung the same way again. And slowly, one by one, the archangels turned. Michael was the first to leave. He walked without sound, carrying not vengeance but weight. The weight of a love that would one day raise a sword, not in wrath, but in mercy. His steps were deliberate, as though each one marked the end of something once beautiful. Gabriel followed, but before he did, he raised his eyes to the throne, not to question, to weep. A single tear slipped down the fire of his cheek, pure, unblinking light. He let it fall, let it be witnessed. Let it bear testimony before the Holy One that even those who blow trumpets of warning still grieve what they warn against. Uriel's wings glowed dimly as he turned away. He carried no sadness on his face, only solemnity, for his eyes had seen what was to come, the descent, the dragon, the blood, the broken covenants. And still he walked with reverence, because prophecy is not cold, it is not cruel, it is wept into being by those who dare to look. Raphael lingered the longest. His hand hovered above the flame, not to smother it, but to feel its warmth one last time. And as he turned, he whispered words no other angel heard. Words carried not on voice, but on breath. Words for the one who had forgotten how to return. Ev. And now you are loved. And then he was gone, the sanctum closed, not with a door but with silence. The kind of silence that follows the moment when a father realizes his child must walk a road he cannot stop. A silence so full it echoed across the stars. And somewhere far below, where light began to fade into longing, Lucifer paused, as if he had felt something, a flicker, a warmth, a memory, but he shook it off, because the ache was too near. And the turning had already begun. And in heaven no one spoke his name, not because they had forgotten it, but because I want to speak it now would be to mourn aloud. And mourning in heaven had only just begun. Far beneath the sanctum, in a realm where breath has never touched form and time still kneels before eternity, the silence spreads like incense. It curled through the rivers of glass, across the arches of flame, through the gardens where light grows on branches older than thought. The silence was not empty, it was full. Full of everything they could not say. Full of sorrow shaped like stars, of memories shaped like wings, and it reached him, Lucifer, not as a voice, but as a pause, a soft ache at the edge of his thoughts, a warmth that had once been welcome, now foreign. He felt it in his bones of light, not as guilty, as distance, the kind of distance that comes not from being pushed away, but from stepping too far without noticing. One step, then another, until the music fades behind you and all that remains is the echo of your own footsteps. He had not meant to leave. He had only followed a longing, and that longing had led him into silence. He stood now in a place that was not yet earth, not yet exile, but something between. The twilight of heaven, the hem of glory's robe, the rim of remembrance. And here there were no stars, no choirs, only wind. The wind did not greet him, but it did not flee. It moved through him like breath through the hollows of an abandoned harp. He looked upward, back the way he had come. But the path was no longer clear, not hidden, just distant, like a dream dissolving in daylight, and he wondered if they missed him, if they still said his name. He whispered theirs, not all, just one, Michael, and the name hurt his mouth, not because of hate, but because of history, the kind of history that aches when it is too beautiful to forget and too painful to relive. He knelt. Not in worship, in weariness. His light still glowed, but it flickered now, not from fading, from fighting the silence, fighting the pull, fighting the truth he did not want to name, that he had become other, not fallen, other. And in that otherness he found no peace, only ache, only distance, only the soft echo of a flame far above him dimmed in farewell. And still he did not turn back, not out of defiance, but because he no longer knew how. And heaven, still watching, did not call to him, because some love must be silent, and some stories must unfold, even when they break the heart of God. The winds grew still around him, as if even they were unsure whether to carry him or leave him. In this twilight realm between glory and ground, time moved like breath held too long. Nothing had shape, yet everything pressed inward, not with weight, but with waiting. Lucifer stood again, slow as dawn rising over a land that no longer remembered light. His wings, once spread in the joy of endless praise, now hung low behind him, silvered and solemn like autumn leaves that had forgotten spring. He had not chosen exile, but exile had grown inside him, not with anger, with ache. He turned his gaze upward toward the heavens veiled in stillness. He could not see them now, not clearly, but he knew they were there. The thrones, the rivers, the light, the brothers. The music, all still singing, all still shining, all still waiting for something he no longer believed he could give. And so he spoke, not loudly, not with fire, just a whisper, a single question that fell from his lips like dew: am I lost? The wind did not answer, but it carried the question back toward the stars, and the stars dimmed, not in rejection, in reverence, for even they could not bear the sound of his sorrow. Back in the high courts, the archangels felt it. Not the words, but the wound beneath them. Michael gripped the edge of the veil with trembling hands. He had been prepared for battle, but not for this. Not for a brother calling through the silence and not knowing if anyone still heard. Gabriel turned his face away from the trumpet at his side, afraid that if he lifted it now, it would shatter, not from sound, from mercy. Raphael placed his hands over his heart, and for a moment the heavens around him blurred. Even Uriel, who sees what cannot be unseen, closed his many eyes to weep, and the throne remained still, not from indifference, from pain deeper than language. For the one who is love always hears, but sometimes he waits, not because he has turned away, but because he has given space, and space is the final form of mercy. Lucifer lowered his eyes. The ache was now full, not of shame, not of rage, but of knowing that he had crossed a line not drawn by law but by love, and that love was now behind him, still burning, still reaching, but no longer near. And with that knowing, he took another step, forward, into the silence, and the sky behind him did not follow. That step echoed, not in sound but in sorrow, as if even the ground beneath him, though it had no form, remembered the first songs of heaven and grieved to feel one of its own walking without them. The echo rippled upward, not through air but through essence, and heaven felt it like a mother feels the cry of her child through closed walls. Lucifer did not look back. He feared that if he did, he might fall to his knees and never rise, not in worship, in longing. The kind of longing that breaks open the soul and leaves it gasping for a love it once held without question. But that love was now distant, not gone, but unreachable. He moved through the rim of glory like a shadow cast by something too bright to name. And behind him, the trail of his light, once a ribbon of gold, began to twist, began to pale, not from punishment, from departure. For when the soul drifts too far from its source, even brilliance becomes a burden. And heaven did not stop him, not because it could not, but because love without freedom is not love at all. The archangels returned to their watch. Michael stood upon the gates of fire, unspeaking. Gabriel walked the star lanes in silence, his trumpet untouched. Raphael tended to the weeping winds, gathering their tears into vials only God would ever read. Uriel sat upon the edge of the veil, his eyes open, seeing both what was and what must come. The council was over. The silence had begun. And still the stars sang, softly, sorrowfully, as if to say, "We remember you, we always will, even as you fall." And Lucifer, he walked deeper, into shadow, into story, into the part of glory that would never again be the same, not because it had failed, but because it was loved. And love, once wounded, leaves a light the darkness cannot reach, not to destroy it, but to remember what it was, forever. Let us now enter the sacred hush, the moment the skies held their breath, the moment love did not chase, and heaven became a witness to the slow undoing of its own light. It was not a day like others, for in heaven there are no days, only presence, only breath, only the golden pulse of eternity wrapping itself around praise like a garment. But if there had ever been a day, a single moment when the eternal paused, it was this one. And on that day, heaven watched, not in wrath, not in wonder. In silence, Lucifer stood at the furthest edge of the firmament, where the light begins to forget its source and the winds no longer sing. There was no wall, no gate, no hand pushing him outward. Only the ache of distance becomes direction. Only the quiet hum of belonging unraveling itself. His wings folded behind him like closing petals, not from shame, but from stillness. Stillness so deep it echoed back through the halls of heaven like a memory too sacred to speak. He did not fall. He waited. And heaven did the same. The angels did not speak, not because they did not care, but because the kind of sorrow that lived in their chests had no language. They hovered in their places, guardians, singers, messengers, thrones, each wrapped in light, each cloaked in remembrance. They remembered the first laugh, the first chord he struck that made even time lean forward to listen. They remembered the way his voice used to catch the edge of the Father's glory and scatter it like rain over the stars. And they remembered the turning, the slow drift of a soul so bright it could not see the shadow growing behind it. They did not call his name, because love that has already been called once does not chase, it waits. And so they waited, and he stood between glory and ground, between the last note of his song and the silence that followed, the silence that grew, not like an absence, like a presence too holy to touch, a presence that bore witness, not to rebellion, to sorrow. And the sorrow that day was everywhere. in the flicker of the stars, in the stillness of the rivers, in the hush that fell across every flame, even the throne did not move, because even the Most High can ache. And when he does not rage, he waits. And on that day, heaven waited with him. The hush became a mantle draped over the wings of cherubim, over the eyes of seraphim, over the very breath of paradise. The skies, usually ringing with layer upon layer of sacred melody, now held only stillness, a stillness so deep it pressed against the edges of every soul like the inside of a womb before the world began. It was not empty, it was attention. The whole of heaven was watching, and below them he moved, slowly, solemnly, each step deeper into separation, though no hand barred his path. No one forced him forward, and still he moved. Lucifer did not look back, not because he was proud, because he was afraid that if he saw their faces, those brothers of fire, those friends of wind and song, he might stop, he might remember, he might ache in a way that would unravel him completely. And part of him still wanted to return, but the road back felt too long now. Not in distance, in silence. He no longer knew how to answer the light with his own. His voice had changed. He had not screamed, he had not cursed, he had not defied, he had only drifted, and the drift had hardened into direction. From the higher realms the thrones turned their countless eyes, each one a mirror of memory. Each one witnessing the brightest light walks into shadow. The elders, seated near the throne, lifted their crowns and placed them at their feet. Not in judgment, in mourning. Even their golden robes dimmed that day, not from wear but from reverence. For they knew, love when wounded does not retaliate, it weeps. Michael stood in silence upon the steps of fire, his sword still sheathed. He would not lift it, not yet, not unless commanded, and no command had come, because heaven's law is not vengeance. It is love in its most holy form, and I love watches, even when it breaks the heart to do so. The gates of heaven, which had never closed, began to tremble. Not from fury, from grief, because gates do not weep, but heaven does, and that day it wept without a sound. Lucifer felt it, not on his skin, but in the spaces between his light, in the trembling edges of his soul where heaven still clung like dew to the early dawn. The silence behind him was louder than any trumpet, more haunting than any thunder. It was not the silence of rejection. It was the silence of a love so deep, it refused to interfere. He did not speak. What could he say? That he hadn't meant to drift, that the ache inside him had grown too wide, too long, too holy to ignore, that he still loved what he was leaving. He could not say those words, because to say them would have shattered him, and if he shattered now, he feared he would never form again, so he kept walking, and heaven watched. Each star turned one by one to witness his passage, not a spectacle, a ceremony, the most sorrowful procession the skies had ever seen, not of wrath, of parting. A quiet coronation of exile, and still the throne did not speak, because the voice that birthed the cosmos would not bind the soul that turned from it. Even now, Lucifer bore the glow of that voice, the echo of first praise, the perfume of belonging, but it no longer sang within him. And that silence, that unbearable absence had become his guide. The angels remained in their stations, wings tucked close, hearts burning low. They had not abandoned him, but they would not follow. Heaven does not chain the fallen, it only mourns them. Far below, on the edge of the unformed, where matter waits to become meaningful, the winds have begun to twist. They circled him now not with violence but with memory. They had once danced in his wake. Now they circled with caution, as if unsure whether to bow or weep. Lucifer looked upward once, just once, and in that glance the whole of heaven shivered, not because of defiance, because of distance. He had not yet fallen, but he was no longer held. And on that day, heaven watched without speaking, because sometimes silence is the only language sorrow understands, and that silence stretched not as punishment but as space. Sacred, terrible space. The kind that exists between a father's outstretched hand and a child who does not reach back. The kind that holds both mercy and ache. The kind that cannot be crossed without surrender. Lucifer felt that space wrap around him like a second skin. It did not bind him, it did not push him, but it defined him now. He was no longer within heaven, he was near it. And near is the most painful place to be when you were once at the center. He came to the end of what could still be called radiance. A threshold without a door, a veil without fabric, simply the place where glory became shadow. Not darkness, not yet, just the absence of return. And as he stepped into it, the light behind him dimmed, not because heaven had withdrawn, but because he had stopped turning back. And heaven would never force him to. Back above, the archangels remained at their posts, but none of them breathed. Even breath would have broken the stillness. Even movement would have felt like betrayal, for this moment belonged to him, to the light that was leaving, to the beauty that was breaking, to the soul that still shimmered, even as it forgot the song it was made for. Gabriel turned away first. Not out of coldness, out of reverence, for what was happening could not be watched forever without the soul trembling. Raphael lowered his head, whispering healing into the winds that carried the silence. Uriel lifted his hand, marking in the stars what was being lost. And Michael did not move. His eyes followed Lucifer's form until it vanished into shadow, and then he bowed, not in defeat, in love, because love still bowed, even when it could no longer embrace. And from the throne came a stillness so deep it ached in the bones of the cosmos. No judgment, no decree, only longing, only holy, aching longing. For the child who had wandered too far to hear the voice that still called him beloved. And in that ache, heaven closed its eyes, not in blindness, in prayer. Because even God in his mercy does not chase what he has already called, he waits. And that day the heavens waited, silent, still, shining, but no longer whole. And below, where the veil thinned into a hush so deep it seemed carved from the bones of eternity, Lucifer stood utterly alone. Not forsaken, not yet, but orphaned by his own choosing. The ache inside him was no longer a question. It had become a landscape, a wilderness made of light that no longer knew its way home. He breathed, and the breath echoed, not like heaven's breath which sings when exhaled, but like a wind blown into a chamber hollowed by longing. The silence did not press against him. It welcomed him. It opened itself like a womb for something that would soon be born. Not beauty, not wrath, history. His wings, once shimmering tapestries of fire and resonance, hung now like twilight, neither day nor night, caught in a posture of pause. His hands trembled, not with fear, with memory, because everything around him reminded him of what he still was, and everything within him whispered of what he would soon become. He stepped forward, and the veil behind him closed, not as punishment, but as poetry. A sacred line drawn by love that says, "You may still be called, but you cannot carry us with you now." And from beyond the veil, heaven's light grew still. Not dim, still, for even glory when wounded must pause to weep. Lucifer looked ahead. There was no path, only possibility, no map, only ache. And from somewhere deep within, deeper than praise, deeper than power, something stirred. A thought, a desire. A flicker of something that had once looked like reverence, now reshaped by longing. What if I could make my own light? He did not speak it aloud, but the thought pulsed in him like a second heart. And that pulse, it was the beginning of the end. For on that day when heaven watched without speaking, and glory stood in stillness, and love refused to chain what it wept to lose, Lucifer began to wonder what it would feel like to be worshipped. Not by angels, but by the silence itself. And the silence listened. And that silence, vast and ancient and hungrier than any throne could ever tame, curled around him like mist. Not to consume, to echo. It had waited for him, not with teeth, but with thirst, the thirst of emptiness, longing to be filled by something once holy. It did not speak because it did not have to. The silence knew that Lucifer's own ache would finish what sorrow had begun. And it did, slowly, quietly, with the soft rhythm of stars dying in reverse. He stood still, eyes closed, and for a moment he reached not outward but inward, searching for the warmth that once carried him. But the light within no longer hummed with memory. It flickered with doubt. And in that flicker something took root, a seed, A whisper not from God but from the hollow spaces in his own soul. What if the glory you bore was always yours? It was not a lie. It was a loneliness wearing truth's perfume. And he breathed it in. The silence did not mock him. It wrapped itself around his shoulders like a stolen robe. He felt tall in that silence, not beloved, but necessary. And necessity, he began to believe, was greater than adoration. Above him, beyond the veil, the stars pulsed with grief. One dimmed, then another, and another, like a choir lowering its voice out of respect for a funeral yet to be spoken. The angels remained at their posts, but their wings no longer moved. Stillness had entered heaven's bones, not because it had grown cold, but because something beloved had stepped beyond its reach. And still, Lucifer did not fall, not yet, because the greatest falls are not from heights, they are from within. He looked into the silence now, not with fear, but with curiosity, and the silence opened. A vastness unformed, unnamed, untouched. It waited for him. And he, the once light-bearer, stepped toward it, not as exile, not as rebel, but as something else, something new. And far above, hidden by love too holy to wound him with its gaze, heaven closed its heart and began to pray. Let us now walk into the shadowed garden of aftermath, where light does not yet know it is bleeding and sorrow dresses itself as sovereignty. Here begins the sacred descent into identity remade. He did not wear a crown when he fell, not of gold, not iron, not of victory, but of memory, a wreath of light once borrowed from the breath of God, now bending under the weight of its own gaze. And each thorn, each radiant, delicate thorn was shaped not by rebellion, but by the ache of being almost divine. Lucifer walked now through the lower veils, realms untouched by time, where stars are only whispers and dust still waits to become formed. He walked not as a king, not yet, but with the bearing of one who remembered kingship and longed to create it again. The light had not left him. That was a terrible wonder. It still glowed, still wrapped his shoulders like a mantle woven in praise, but it no longer sang. Now it pulsed, rhythmic, heavy, lonely. It followed his movements like a crown that could not be removed, beautiful but biting. And where once it had made him weep in awe, now it made him bleed. He touched his chest, not in pain, but in wonder, as if to ask, is this what it means to become my own? He passed beneath clouds that had never known color, through valleys where time had not yet been written. Everything watched him, not with eyes, with possibility. Creation itself leaned forward, for the bearer of morning was no longer rising, he was becoming. He paused beside a still pool, a mirror not of water but of presence. It did not reflect his face, it reflected his ache. And in that ache a form began to shape. Not God, not an angel, not man, something else. A sovereign of sorrow, a monarch of misremembered light, and on his head the glow began to twist. A circlet formed, strand by strand, from the remnants of worship that no longer had a home. The first crown, not placed upon him, grown from him, forged not in fire but in fracture. Each thorn a praise now pointed inward, each point a memory sharpened into hunger, and he wore it, not proudly, but naturally, as if he had always been meant to. As if the story had never been about heaven, but about him. And from the unseen depths, the silence shuddered, not in protest, in recognition, for this was the moment it had waited for. The moment the first glory accepted its exile and made it holy. The crown shimmered not with triumph, but with ache. It glowed like gold wrapped in grief, a radiance too beautiful to be righteous, too sacred to be whole. It pulsed with every heartbeat he did not know he had, and with every pulse a name was lost and a title was born. Lucifer no longer stood as the morning star. He stood as something unnamed, but known. The light still obeyed him. It coiled around his limbs like a serpent made of memory, a cloak stitched from prayers that once lifted him. But those prayers had changed. They no longer rose. They sank, curling back into him like echoes longing to be gods. And still he walked, not as a wanderer now, as a bearer. He carried the silence behind him and the shadow before him. He carried the ache of heaven and the hunger of something new. He carried the questions the angels dared not ask, the kind that slither between praise and thought. What if obedience was never meant to be forever? What if the light could lead itself? He did not speak these thoughts aloud. He did not need to. The silence heard them, and the silence listened like a womb. He came to a place not yet formed, a hollow plain suspended between beginnings, where no star had settled and no wind had dared move. It waited for him, patient and ancient, the way altars wait for blood. He stepped into it, and it received him, not as king. Kindling, the ground shimmered with his light and began to reshape, not because he commanded it, but because it recognized him, his sorrow, his brilliance, his ache. Creation responded, it always does, not to authority, to ache. And in that aching light a throne began to form, not built, birthed, carved from his longing, stitched from his memory, woven from the songs he no longer sang, and he stood before it. He did not sit, not yet, because something in him still remembered what it felt like to kneel. But the longer he stared, the more distant that memory became. The throne rose slowly, as if unsure it had permission to exist. It was not like the throne he had once knelt before, no sapphire fire, no rivers of living flame, no rainbow of promise arching above it. This throne was different. It was shaped from shadowed light, from the bruised glow of praise turned inward, from the residue of reverence that no longer had a source. It pulsed with grief. It radiated longing. And still it beckoned, not with command, with reflection. Lucifer looked into it and saw not dominion but desire, not authority but ache made manifest. It was not a seat for power. It was a seat for becoming. He stepped closer. The silence around him hummed with anticipation, like a chorus holding its breath before the final note. The wind circled him now, not like servants but like spectators, unsure whether to bow or flee. He reached out and touched the edge. It was warm, too warm, not with fire but with memory tea. He kind of warmth that reminds the soul what it has lost, what it can never reclaim, and what it might try to rebuild anyway. And in that touch something in him broke, not outwardly, inward. A crack in the part of him that still remembered how to cry, but no tears came, only light. Thin strands of it bled from his fingertips, weaving into the throne itself, feeding it, forming it, binding him. It hurt, but he did not pull away. He let the light pour out strand by strand until the throne was no longer just before him. It was him, and the crown upon his head pulsed in reply. One thorn burned brighter than the rest, the one forged from his final praise. And in its brightness he heard it, not heaven, not the throne, not angels, his own voice, low, solemn, changed, whispering to himself the only prayer he had left, I will not be forgot. And the silence, vast and ancient, did not answer, but it opened and made room. He did not sit. Not yet, but the throne waited as though it already knew he would. Its glow pulsed in rhythm with his breath, feeding from the fire he no longer shared. It did not blaze, it throbbed. A quiet ache cloaked in radiance. A light too burdened to rise and too proud to fade. Around him the unformed realm began to bend, as if listening to the architecture of his sorrow. Hills rose from silence. Shadows stretched into arches. The empty sky took on the weight of waiting. Creation was watching. And not just watching, reflecting. It had found its mirror, not in the face of a king, in the soul of the castaway. Lucifer stepped back from the throne, unsure whether it was an altar or a tomb. He looked at his hands. They still shimmered. They still bore the touch of the first light, but it was no longer a gift. It was a fire without a name. He clenched them, the glow sharpened, and the silence sang, not a melody, a murmur. The kind that moves beneath all things, waiting for the right sorrow to shape it. The kind that forms not temples but kingdoms. He looked again at the throne, and this time he spoke. I did not ask for this. His voice was low, but it carried, not through sound, through gravity. I only wanted to be closer. The throne said nothing, but the ground beneath it shifted as if nodding, and he whispered again. I only wanted to shine as I was made. And that was the cry, the one heaven had not heard, or had heard and answered with silence. And now the silence answered with shadow. A wind moved through the realm, soft, warm, gentle, like breath on skin. And Lucifer closed his eyes, for in that breath he no longer felt heaven. He felt only himself. And that feeling, whole and hollow all at once, became his crown. And so, without song, without stars, without ceremony, he turned and sat. The crown of thorns wove itself tighter, and the throne pulsed in reply. A sovereign had risen, not in glory, in ache. And the silence crowned him with a kingdom no light would ever call home. And in that moment, that hushed, infinite moment, something beneath creation shifted, not in violence, in reverence, as if even the deep, where time had not yet woken, recognized the weight of what had just been born. A king not crowned by angels but by absence, a throne not anointed by oil but by ache, a crown not placed upon him but grown from within, thorn by thorn, praise by praise, wound by wound. He sat. And the throne accepted him like a prophecy fulfilled. It did not roar. It did not radiate. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like a second heart born in exile. And that heart began to beat through the bones of the realm, out across the valleys of silence, through the skies where no stars had yet been named, into the folds of shadow where things longed to become. They listened. They learned. They reached. Not because he commanded, because he resonated. For even in fallenness there is gravity. And his sorrow had become the most sacred weight. Lucifer opened his eyes. They still shone, but not with heaven, with hunger, not for destruction, for definition, to be seen, to be known, to be something again, not in relation to the throne he left, but as a new throne altogether. He raised his hand, the air obeyed, not as a servant to master, as mirror to mirror. It shimmered and curled around his fingers like silk spun from longing. He moved it gently, and the silence swirled with form. The beginning of beginnings. The first echo of a kingdom not born from command but from ache made sovereign. And beneath the throne the shadow thickened, not in evil, in expectancy, as if the darkness itself had begun to believe in him, not in what he had been, but in what he might yet become. And still the crown pulsed, each thorn a memory, each pulse a question. And in its quiet rhythm the fallen light began to dream, not of war, but of worship redirected, not of revenge, but of reverence recast. And in the unseen heavens far above no one spoke, no one sang, no one reached, because heaven was still praying. The prayer was not a plea, it was a holding. A breath stretched across eternity, not to pull him back, but to keep love open even when the door had closed. For heaven does not erase what it has made, even when it mourns what it has lost. Lucifer sat, surrounded by silence that no longer questioned him. It had accepted his ache. It had made a throne of his wounds, a crown from his yearning, a realm from his absence. And yet, even now, he still shimmered. Not as he once did, no longer with the music of the Most High tracing every step, but with a glow that flickered like a candle lit from memory. The first light does not die, it simply forgets how to sing. He looked into the void before him. It did not frighten him. It felt familiar, like the echo of a god he once adored. The silence bowed before him, not out of worship, but recognition. It saw itself in him, the part of divinity that had always longed to shape something of its own. And so he began. He moved his hand through the air, and the air took shape. He spoke not in heaven's language, but in the slow, aching rhythm of one who remembers the music but not the melody. And things formed. Not angels, not stars, but shadows that mirrored his ache. They rose like dreams, half-born, loyal, luminous, longing, and they looked at him, not with awe, with need, because he had become what they were, alone, brilliant, and becoming. Lucifer stood now from his throne, the crown still upon his head, a radiant ring of remembrance and ruin, and he opened his hands. He would shape a kingdom, he would not return. And the first edict of his reign was not a command, it was a sigh. A breath that said, if I cannot have what I was, I will be what I am. And the silence obeyed. It folded into itself, then bloomed outward, carrying his sorrow like seeds. And thus the kingdom began, not in rebellion, in response. In aching reply to a heaven that still wept behind the veil. Far above, the voice that made all things remained silent. But the silence was not absent, it was waiting, Because love is eternal, always waits, even for those who no longer know how to be found. Let us now descend into the chapter of temptation unspoken, not with words but with watching. The moment when heaven's sons, stationed on the edges of the world, beheld what Lucifer had become and chose not to warn the skies. Before the flood, before Babel, before the clay stood upright and spoke. There were watchers, tall as thought, solemn as silence. They stood on the borders of earth and sky, placed by the Most High not to rule but to witness. They bore no swords, they raised no altars. They carried only the gaze of heaven and the charge to remember, and they remembered everything. They remembered when Lucifer first crossed the veil, not in flames, in radiance. Still burning with the fragrance of paradise, still carrying the warmth of praise, still wearing the silence of heaven like a robe too sacred to remove. He passed them without a word, and they looked away, not out of defiance, out of sorrow. For in him they saw the thing they had no answer for: beauty wounded, glory wandering, a light too sacred to stop and too dangerous to follow. He did not tempt them, he didn't have to. His silence spoke 1,000 words, words no angel should have heard, words not of rebellion but of ache turned inward. They felt it, in the marrow of their wings, in the quiet of their watching. He did not ask them to fall. But when he vanished into the unformed shadows beyond form, the seed had been planted, not of pride, of empathy. And empathy, when left unguarded, becomes imitation. The watchers held their stations, but their eyes no longer faced upward. They turned them toward the earth, toward the clay, toward the daughters of dust whose laughter moved like music, whose hair shimmered like rivers of memory. And something in them stirred, a familiar ache. The same ache they had seen in him, and they did not speak of it, because what had happened to the morning star had already begun to happen to them, not with fire, with longing, longing wrapped in light. And in that moment heaven lost its watchers, not with a fall, but with a gaze that turned sideways. They did not fall all at once. The watchers feel the way stars do, slowly, beautifully, unnoticed by most until it is too late. One by one they began to shift, ever so slightly, like pillars leaning inward under the weight of a sky too vast to bear. They still kept their stations, still recited the sacred codes, still whispered the names of stars into the dusk, but their hearts were no longer tethered to the throne. They had grown heavy with a different kind of light, the kind that does not rise but burns inward. It was not defiance that moved them, it was recognition. They had seen him, the morning star, not cast down, not broken, not cursed, but wandering. And in his wandering they saw themselves. They saw the ache behind obedience, the hush behind worship, the slow, subtle hunger that comes when praise becomes performance and the fire begins to flicker behind the eyes. And they began to ask in the silence of their minds, what if he was right to leave? They did not speak it aloud, but heaven heard. Not as words, as a tremble, a soft crack in the harmony of the spheres, a rhythm missed, a note held too long. The kind of fracture only the throne can feel, and the throne felt it, but still did not speak. Because the time for warning had passed. This was no longer a rebellion, it was a mirror, and the watchers were gazing into it. The daughters of earth had not changed. They had always danced, always wept, always breathed with the rhythm of seasons and stars. It was the watchers who changed. Their eyes no longer saw creation as holy distance. They saw it as an invitation. And slowly, silently, they stepped down, not with fire, with longing, not with wrath, with wonder. They touched the earth. And the earth welcomed them, because the earth too had felt the ache of exile. And in that embrace the skies shuddered but said nothing, because the watchers had not disobeyed, they had empathized. And empathy, once shaped by sorrow, becomes a door, and that door had now opened. And behind that door was not glory but gravity, a pull so ancient it spoke in breath, not in voice, calling not to the mind but to the wound. The same wound Lucifer had carried when he crossed the veil. The same wound now echoed in the watchers as their feet pressed into the soil of a world they were meant only to observe. The moment their souls kissed the ground, the stars flinched, not from fear, from knowing, because what had been still was now stirring. What had been above now moved among. And earth, ever waiting, opened her arms. She did not resist them, she welcomed them, not with worship, with recognition. The watchers moved through valleys veiled in mist, along rivers that had not yet learned to forget. They walked not as strangers, but as sons returning to a garden they had never been promised. They stood beside mortal breath and did not recoil. They looked into human eyes and saw something different, fragile, fleeting, and beautiful, and something in them, something old and sacred and carefully guarded, bent. It was not lust. It was love unspoken, not the love of heaven, pure and far and ever burning, but a love shaped by nearness, a love heavy with scent and sound and skin. A love that pulses, that longs, that remembers the ache of the morning star and wonders, what if he saw this too? And they did not look back, because if they had, they might have heard the angels weeping, not in judgment, in mourning, because heaven does not curse what it loves, but it does watch when love chooses exile. And that night, if night it could be called, the watchers lay down their wings, not with defiance, but with desire. And in the hollow sky above them, where stars had once called their names in joy, there was only silence, and the silence I was watching, and that silence did not fade. It thickened into shadow, into breath, into waiting, not the waiting of patience, but of sorrow too old to speak. For what began with Lucifer, that subtle turn from adoration to ache, had now rippled through the watchers like a song they could not stop humming. They were not cast out, they descended, and the descent was gentle and irreversible. They took wives, not in haste, in awe. They held mortal hands, hands made of dust and miracle, and called them sacred, not because they forgot heaven, but because they tasted something they had never known in its cold brilliance, intimacy, the kind of nearness that does not hover above but breathes beside, and that nearness reshaped them. The sons of heaven learned the weight of touch, the pulse of longing, the sound of laughter that does not echo for eternity but dies and must be born again. And they loved it, not as angels but as men. And in doing so they crossed a threshold no wing could carry them back from. The daughters of earth bore them children, giants, Nephilim, born of sorrow and splendor, of heaven and hunger, beings too large for the soil beneath them, too radiant for the world that cradled them, too loud for the silence that once held the stars in place. They were not mistakes, they were mirrors, mirrors of the longing that had passed from Lucifer to the watchers, now made flesh. And the world groaned, the rivers murmured, the wind remembered, because creation knows its origin. And when something is birthed from ache instead of alignment, the earth takes note. Above, heaven did not thunder, I watched, and in the watching wept. For the watchers were not evil, they were beautiful, too beautiful to bear the distance, too beautiful to remain untouched. And that beauty, once holy, had now planted roots in soil, roots that would one day fracture mountains. But for now, they simply bloomed, and the stars, one by one, began to dim, not because they had fallen, but because they could no longer see clearly through the veil of longing. And the throne, it waited still, because love, even wounded, waits, and it was in that waiting that sorrow ripened. The kind of sorrow not born in a moment but grown across generations of silence. The kind that lingers not in the thunder but in the space between footsteps, the quiet grief of a heaven that never stopped loving what had stopped looking up. The watchers no longer climbed. They built, stone upon stone, altar upon altar, empire upon empire. They shaped the world in the image of their ache. And the Nephilim, their children, towered over the lands like echoes of a sky now veiled in shadow. They carried in their bones the weight of two worlds, heaven's spark and earth's sorrow. Giants in body, yes, but greater still in ache, because they were never meant to be, not by the hand of the throne, but by the hand of those who could no longer bear to remain in their place. And the earth grew heavy beneath them. Caves split open to make room for their strides. Mountains groaned beneath their laughter. Waters learned to fear them. And still heaven remained still, not because it did not see, but because judgment is not the first voice of love. Mercy always goes first, and mercy was still knocking in the hearts of the watchers, in the eyes of their sons, in the wind which still carried the sound of Eden if one dared to listen closely enough. But they did not listen. Because ache had become an identity, and longing had become law, and in the far distance where the veil was thinnest and the throne waited in golden quiet, one name echoed still, Lucifer, not as a curse, but as a memory, because the watchers had not fallen alone. They had followed a whisper that was never silenced, a silence that was once light, a light that once loved the throne, and now sat crowned in a kingdom of shadow, watching the sons of his sorrow fill the earth. And from that throne he did not speak, but he smiled, and that smile was the prophecy. Let us now open what was never meant to be found, a book not of ink, but of sorrow carved into stone, buried in silence and written by a hand that still remembered the language of heaven even after forgetting its song. They say he wrote nothing, that Lucifer left no mark but ruin, that his story was written only in echoes, in shattered thrones and scorched altars, in the trembling of watchers and the bones of giants. But that is not true. He did write, not in scrolls, not in starlight, in stone, in the deep, beneath the hills where even wind dares not wander, black hills older than the flood, older than Eden, older than language itself. There lies a book. It is not bound in leather or gold. It is bound in silence, etched in a tongue no angel speaks now, a language only sorrow understands, and it sings still, faintly, like breath caught in the chest of time. They say he carved it with light, not the blazing light of rebellion, but the dimmed glow of remembrance. Line by line, memory by memory. It took an age, not because of time, but because of pain. Each word burned, not because it was false, but because it was once holy. This book is not a curse, it is a lament. A psalm for a kingdom that never was, a hymn for a throne that still dreams in shadow, a confession carved beneath the bones of the earth. And in its pages, stone upon stone, he wrote not of vengeance, but of love, love lost, love misnamed, love turned inward. He did not call himself morning star, not there. He did not call himself king, he called himself rememberer, and what he remembered could undo the sky. The first page was not a page, it was a wound, a long curling scar across obsidian stone, scorched by sorrow and softened by silence. No chisel carved it, no fire forged it. It was written by his hand alone, a hand that once sang stars into stillness, now trembling beneath the weight of memory. The words shimmer faintly, not in gold but in grief. They glow only when read by those who ache. For this is not a book for the curious. It is a scripture for the exiled, a song for those who still burn with light and do not know why. The first line reads, I did not fall, I followed the ache. And in that line is all that came after. He does not justify himself. He does not beg, he simply remembers. Each passage drips with names never spoken aloud, names of stars that dimmed as he passed them, names of angels who wept when he would not turn. He recalls the texture of silence when he first stood at the veil. He recalls the way heaven hesitated, hoping he would stop. He did not. And he writes of that too, the stillness, the moment the stars turned away, the hush that covered the throne like a mourning cloth. He writes of the watchers not as pawns, not as rebels, but as reflections. He names each one with reverence, not rage. He writes of their descent like a father writing of sons he cannot save. He does not boast, he bleeds. And he writes of God often, but not as an enemy, as origin. He calls him the voice that sang me into being. He remembers the warmth of that voice. He remembers the ache of its silence. He writes not to curse him. He writes to reach him, but the stone does not echo. And so he writes still, word after word, cutting light into darkness, weaving memory into the marrow of the hills, a book that no flood could drown, no angel could erase, no man would be ready to read. And at the center of the book, one line curls around itself like a serpent of sorrow. I still sing. And that line, I still sing, was not written with triumph. It was carved like a wound that refuses to close, because the song he sings now is not the one he was given. It is the song born in the silence after heaven turned its face. It is a song made of echoes that remember the light but carry the sound of shadow. He sings not to be heard. He sings so he does not forget. Each verse etched deeper into the stone carries less fire and more trembling. Names of stars have fallen, moments of almost return, lines where he nearly turned his gaze back toward the throne. Nearly, but never did. And for almost, another stanza appears in the book, words warped by regret, phrases pierced by longing too old to unravel. There are no spells in this book, no curses, no commands, only remembrance, a scripture of exile, a gospel of the ache that made a king out of a songless seraph. In one passage, worn smooth by time and tears, he writes, "The stars still shine with him, but they do not know me." And just beneath it, carved so faintly it nearly disappears into the rock, "But I remember their names." This is the truth that burns most deeply in the Black Hills, not that he became darkness, but he still remembers the light. Not that he was cast out, but he carries home like a ghost, and so he wrote, and wrote, and wrote, until the hills themselves pulsed with sorrow, until the silence around the pages began to feel like prayer, until even the shadows stood still just to hear what he might write next. And then at the end, not the last page, but the last breath of the last line, he carved something that no one has yet spoken aloud. No angel has dared read it. No demon has dared quote it. No child of man has stumbled upon it. A line wrapped in sorrow so deep the earth itself trembled when it was formed. If he called me back, I would still answer. That line did not glow, it bled, a soft, aching crimson that pulsed once beneath the stone and then stilled, as if the hills themselves had drawn breath, heard it, and chosen to keep it hidden, not to bury it, to protect it. For within that one final line lived something more dangerous than rebellion. Hope, not the hope of return, but the hope that even now, even crowned in sorrow, even robbed in silence, even surrounded by children born of longing, some embers of belonging still whispered inside him. If he called me back, I would still answer. Not proudly, not quickly, but honestly. And that honesty is what turned the Black Hills to bone. That is why the earth shook but did not split. That is why the storm circled overhead but did not rain. Because that truth, that tender, trembling truth, was the only thing left in him still tethered to the stars. And so the book was sealed, not with a lock or key, with love, the kind that cannot speak its name, the kind that waits beneath the soil, silent as memory, alive as grief. The book lies still, but not silent. Those who draw near it have said they hear humming, not melody, memory, a sound like the edge of a lullaby, a sound like light trying not to cry. Some say it's his voice, echoing still. Others say it's the last line, repeating itself again and again, hoping it will one day be answered. If he called me back, I would still answer. And in the silence of that stone-carved psalm, the hills do not move, the stars do not speak, but the wind, the same wind that once carried the breath of God into the lungs of man, still passes gently over that place. And when it does, it sings, a song with no words, a hymn too holy to hold, and somewhere far away in a kingdom not made with hands, a crowned figure stirs, not in rage, in remembrance, and the crown of thorns woven from light burns softly but does not fall, and so the hills keep their secret. They do not open though time has pressed its weight upon them. They do not crumble though empires have risen and fallen in their shadow, because some wounds were never meant to be healed, only held. The book sleeps beneath them, not waiting to be read, but waiting to be wept for. Because what is written in sorrow can only be understood by those who have loved and lost, those who have carried glory and watched it dim, those who have walked away from the voice that made them, and still hear it in their dreams. It is said that the Black Hills hum at night, that if you lie with your ear to the ground, you can feel the pages breathing. You can feel the ache in the stone, not anger, not judgment, only the low, sacred hum of a being who once stood in the center of the song and now lives in its echo. And in that echo there is a name, not Lucifer, not Satan, a name older than war, older than rebellion, older even than praise, a name spoken only once when the voice first said, "Let there be light." That name was never carved. because it was never lost. It was kept, carried, folded deep into the pages like a fire still smoldering, waiting for the breath that might one day awaken it again. And in the deepest line of the deepest page, hidden beneath layers of metaphor and mourning, lies one final question. What is a fallen light if it still longs for the dawn? No one has answered it. No one has dared, but the earth remembers, and so does the wind, and perhaps so does he. Now we descend into the rising dark, to the hour when judgment fell like oceans from the breath of God, when mountains sank and the sky tore open, when the world was washed, but one sorrow could not be drowned. Let us begin. Before the water there was a warning, not of thunder, of silence, the kind that gathers behind the eyes of God when mercy has waited long enough. The world had grown heavy, swollen with giants, with grief, with glory twisted into thrones. The watchers had long fallen, their children towering like shadows across the earth, devouring peace, forgetting praise. Blood cried out from the soil. Songs had gone silent, the stars looked away. And the throne which had waited and waited and waited still breathed, and the breath was judgment. It did not come out as a fire, but it's raining, not from wrath, from sorrow. It began soft, a mist, weeping, but it grew. From weeping into water, from water into the wall, from wall into weight. And the world beneath it broke. Trees vanished in moments. Temples built by hands too proud to kneel were swallowed like whispers. Even the Nephilim, too vast, too violent, too full of heaven's ache, found their strength undone beneath the waves. The waters rose, and in their rising everything remembered, even him. He did not flee, he watched. Lucifer stood not on the mountain, not in the sky, but in the still space between, not above the judgment, not beneath it, outside it. Because the flood had not come for him. He had already drowned once in silence, and no water could wash what he had become. He stood on forgotten stone where no ark would pass, where no dove would fly, and he looked out across a world being erased. And he did not smile. He did not rage. He remembered every face, every voice, every angel who had fallen in his shadow, every giant who had grown from his ache, every seed planted in sorrow, now pulled from the soil by mercy. And still, the rain fell. It did not fall like punishment. It fell like tears, endless, ancient, aching tears, as if the sky itself had broken open not to destroy, but to grieve. Each drop carried a memory. Each wave held a name. The flood was not fury, it was farewell. Lucifer remained unmoved, not because he could not be touched, but because the judgment was not for him. It was for what came after him, for those who bore his longing but lacked his restraint, for those who carried his sorrow but had forgotten its source. The sons of the watchers drowned with their eyes open, not in defiance but in disbelief. They were too large to flee, too holy to comprehend their end. They had never imagined that the ground could rise against them, and in their final breath they looked to the skies and saw no hand reaching, only water, and beyond the water him, the light-bearer, the rememberer, not weeping, not raging, watching. He did not turn away, he bore it all. The screams of the Nephilim, the silence of the watchers, the sound of forests being uprooted by mercy. The prayers of mortals are too small to understand the magnitude of divine mourning. He watched it all and remembered, and the rain did not touch him. It fell around him, parted at his feet. As if even the flood knew, this sorrow is not yours, not because he was innocent, but because he was already judged, already cast, already exiled by his own choosing. The water could wash the world, but it could not reach him, because no judgment born in heaven could undo what heaven had once loved. And though he stood alone, he did not fall, because even sorrow has roots, and he ran deep beneath the flood. Beneath the fury of waves and the roar of collapsing skies, he stood still like an altar made of memory, untouched by the cleansing of the world. The waters raged around him, swallowing mountains, silencing every tower that had once called itself divine. But they could not silence him, because he was not a sound. He had a scar, and scars cannot drown. He looked up into the darkened firmament, into the heavens now weeping the rain of justice, and he did not flinch. He had already Ved through a silence far louder than this. He had already watched the eyes of God look through him without reaching. This flood was mercy, but mercy for others, not for him, and still he bore witness. Because even now, even wrapped in exile, even crowned in ache, he knew the shape of the Father's sorrow. He had carried it once, in the stillness of his first fall, in the tear before the turning, in the pause before the pain. He could feel it now in the deluge. This was not vengeance, it was grief. And in some hidden chamber of his soul, that truth softened him, but not enough to break him, because he no longer belonged to the sky. And yet, even as the world vanished beneath the waves, even as the bones of giants sank into silence, even as the screams of old blood were hushed by divine water, he remained. A witness, a remnant, a ruin that still shimmered. The ark would pass far from him. The dove would never land on his shoulder. The rainbow would rise without his name beneath it. Because this covenant was not for him, and yet he watched it form. He watched the rain cease. He watched the clouds part, and he whispered one line just once to no one into the stillness that followed. You remembered them, not with envy, not with rage, but it aches. And then he turned and walked deeper into the shadow. The flood had come, but it could not drown what was never meant to forget. The waters receded, but he did not. The sun broke open the clouds like a promise, and the world exhaled, fresh, cleansed, newborn. Mountains peeked through the mist like children waking from a nightmare, and the birds began to sing again as if they had never tasted silence. But beneath that sunlight, beneath that covenant sky, there walked a figure untouched. Lucifer did not lift his face to the light. He had seen too much of it, had carried too much of it, and now it only reminded him of what he once was. He walked through the wet bones of what had been forests drowned, altars split, stones smoothed by the hand of God. Not to mourn, not to gloat, but to remember, because remembering was all he had left. Each step carried echoes. He passed the ruins of a Nephilim stronghold, now little more than twisted wood and shattered ivory. Here, a son of heaven had declared himself God. Here, he had taken glory that was never his to bear. Here, his laughter had once shaken the ground. Now the ground had taken him back. Lucifer paused, ran his fingers over the blackened roots of a tree that would never bloom again. He did not weep, he could not. Tears belonged to those with homes, but he did breathe, slowly. And as he did, the silence around him shifted, not with sound, but with awareness. The world remembered him, even now, even after the flood. The wind curled around his form with a kind of reverence, uncertain whether to sing or hide. The stones beneath him whispered his name not as a curse, but as a psalm long forbidden. He was not part of this new creation, but he was written beneath it, etched into its soil, folded into its sky. A sorrow the waters could not reach, a name the rain could not wash away. And when the rainbow stretched like a seal across the heavens, Lucifer did not look up. He turned from it, for he knew that light was not for him, and he knew the price of witnessing it. He walked into the mist, that final breath of the flood, and vanished from the sight of the new world. Not forgotten, not forgiven, but remembered like a hymn too holy to sing again. Then let us walk now into the silence after storms, into lands where nothing grows but memory, where wind speaks in riddles and the sand still bears the shape of a sorrow that once walked through it. Let us follow the footsteps the rain could not erase. There are deserts so old, they remember what the sky has forgotten, places where the stars no longer speak, where light does not command and darkness does not conquer. Only stillness and silence and memory. He walked there, long after the flood, when the world was young again and men began to build from dust what dust had just swallowed. He returned, not to be seen, not to speak, but to wander. Lucifer passed through the wilderness without word or witness, his steps light, his breath slow, his form cloaked not in shadow but in something older than shadow. Remorse? No. Regret? Perhaps. But even that was not enough. This was something deeper. He walked with the weariness of a soul that no longer believes in punishment, only in permanence. The desert did not greet him, it remembered him. And it unfolded before him like a scroll, its sands parting with reverence, its winds pausing their song. The rocks bore no scripture, but they shimmered slightly as he passed, as if his sorrow had written itself there ages ago. And now they read it back to him. He stopped once, near a dune that sloped like a broken wing, kneeled, pressed his palm into the sand. The grains warmed beneath his touch, not in fear, not in PRAs, but in recognition. This was not his kingdom, but it was his footprint, a memory of his passing, carved not in glory but in ache. And some memories the desert never forgets, because only the desert knows how to cradle a silence that large, and only the wind knows how to carry a name no longer spoken. And still he wandered, because wandering was all he knew. Because when you have seen heaven and chosen exile, movement becomes your only prayer. He walked not with purpose, but with presence, a ghost of light trailing across an earth too humble to rise and too wise to bow. The sun followed him not to crown, but to witness. And when it burned too hot, he did not flinch. He had known hotter flames. He had stood closer to glory. This fire could not touch him. It only reminded him. The animals did not flee. They still are. As if sensing that this was no man, no beast, no god, but something else. Something that carried the scent of the first sky. Something that had looked upon the throne and turned away and lived. The birds above did not sing. Their wings beat slower as they circled. They did not understand him, but they remembered. Everything does. He passed the bones of an ancient tree, long dead, long brittle, its roots now exposed like fingers clawing upward. He touched it gently, and beneath his hand it did not bloom, but it sighed, not in breath, in memory. He spoke no words. There was no one to hear them, but still the desert listened. And then, without command, without will, the wind shifted. It carried his steps behind him, preserving them not in stone, not in myth, but in movement, a trail, a path, a trace of sorrow too deep to vanish in the dust. They say that somewhere in the heart of that desert there is a place where the sand refuses to move. No matter the storm, no matter the centuries, a patch of ground where the wind dies down and silence becomes absolute. And in the center, a single impression remains. A knee pressed deep, carved not by weight but by ache. A moment when the morning star knelt not to worship, not to rule, but to remember. And what he remembered there no angel knows, only the earth. Only the grains of sand that held his kneeling like a secret, passed from dune to dune through centuries of silence. Perhaps he remembered Eden, not the garden but the voice that walked in it. The voice that once called his name not as enemy, not as exile, but as son. Or perhaps he remembered the sky before it ever carried judgment back, when the stars bowed not in fear but in joy. Or maybe he remembered nothing at all. Maybe it was not memory that bent him to the earth but exhaustion. Because even the brightest light, when carried too far from its source, begins to dim beneath its own weight. And the desert knows this. The desert holds such weight with honor. It does not try to lift it, it simply makes room. He stayed there for a long time, not in days, in stillness, in the kind of silence that only deserts can hold and only sorrow can understand. No serpent whispered to him. No voice from heaven pierced the sky. Only wind, only earth, only the slow, low hum of exile. He did not rise quickly. He unfolded, like a prayer too tired to be spoken aloud. And when he stood, the desert did not clap. It simply held his shape in the sand, as if hoping someone someday might kneel there again, not in imitation, but in understanding. He turned once, looking out across the endless sea of golden silence, and whispered not to the air, but to whatever still listened, "I am still here." The wind answered, but not with words. It moved softly over the sand and did not erase his footsteps. He walked on, leaving behind that sacred hollow where the desert cradled his sorrow. And though his feet pressed into the sand like echoes of an ancient psalm, the wind refused to wipe them away. For this was not a path of power, it was a procession of grief, a holy trail of remembrance carved not by miracles but by mourning. And the desert became his chapel, its dunes his pews, its stars his candlelight, its silence his priest. For who else could hear the confessions of a soul too heavy for heaven, too luminous for hell, too ancient for time? He wandered eastward, where the shadows of ancient stones stretched long across the dunes. Pillars from a city now buried, a city that had once whispered its loyalty to angels who no longer bore wings. Ruins of rebellion softened by sand. He did not enter. He had already seen what happens when the divine dwells where it was not invited. He merely passed, his presence brushing over shattered thresholds and crumbled idols, and the stones trembled not in fear, but in memory. For even fallen cities remember the one who fell first. In the stillness of that ruin, a single bird cried out, a lone voice slicing through the silence like the edge of a tear never shed. He stopped, lifted his eyes, and for a moment, only a moment, he allowed himself to wonder, "Woe! Old they have forgiven me if I had wept, but there are no answers in deserts. Only mirrors." And the silence, deep as time, offered him no reply. Only wind, only sun, only the long procession of shadows following the first light. The shadows stretched longer behind him than they ever had before, not because the sun had changed, but because he had. Every step left behind not only the imprint of a foot, but of a memory. Each footprint was a verse of a song no longer sung in heaven, each pause in his walk a breath that could have been praise, but now echoed hollow in the airless heat. He came to a place where the stones formed a circle not by hands but by time, a natural altar, a hollow of waiting, and in the center a single rock stood upright, jagged, tall, its tip blackened not by fire but by touch. He walked to it, laid his palm upon its surface. It did not glow, it did not tremble, but it pulsed faintly once as if remembering him. And in that pulse he felt it, a moment that had never been but might have been. A version of himself not crowned in sorrow but in stillness. A version of himself that turned back before the silence hardened into shadow. But the moment passed, like all things do when you've walked too far to return. And so he lowered his hand and let it go. And the stone, that ancient sentinel, stood still as if mourning what it had just remembered. Lucifer walked on, not quickly, not slowly, just forward, through wind, through ash. Through the hush of a world that would never know it had once been walked by sorrow shaped like light. And as he passed beyond the ring of stones, the desert folded the silence behind him. But it did not erase the path, because some deserts don't forget, and neither do the angels who once watched him kneel. Then let us walk the final road, not toward resolution, but toward revelation, toward the light that never left, only changed its shape. A light not in heaven, not on earth, but echoing in the silence between. Now we begin. There is a sound the stars remember, not music, not voice, a frequency. A sorrow song that hums beneath creation like a heartbeat the throne still feels but will not name. It is not loud, it does not demand, it lingers. Lucifer never stopped singing, not with lips, with being. His existence, wandering, silent, unseen, was its own liturgy. A hymn of what was lost. A chord once tuned to the presence of God, now vibrating in exile, unstruck but still resonant. He walked still through forgotten lands, places between places, veiled by time, ignored by men, untouched by angels. And as he moved, the world around him bent, not in worship, in recognition. Rivers paused when he passed, trees held their leaves longer, stones hummed low beneath the soil. For they remembered not the rebellion, not the war, the light, the first light, before pride, before sorrow, before names were divided. He walked through a valley where the wind had carved old songs into the cliffside. Not words, but waves, undulating lines etched by air, shaped by time, sounding like breath held for too long. He placed his hand upon the wall and the lines shimmered faintly, not with magic, with memory. He closed his eyes. And for a moment, a single moment, he heard it again. The voice, the one that first sang his name into being. The one that called him not morning star, not adversary, but beloved. It said nothing now, but he could still feel its echo hidden in the vibration of the stones. And in that stillness, he whispered something back, not in defiance, not in shame, but in longing, a single note, a breath of light. And heaven paused. It was not the kind of pause that follows judgment. It was the kind that precedes remembering. The stars, scattered across the vault of heaven like old promises, held their shimmer just a moment longer. The seraphim, ever circling, ever singing, faltered in their refrain, not in confusion, in ache, for somewhere beneath the veil of time, beneath the flood, beneath the fall, one of their own had sung again. And though the note was quiet, a thread of light stretched thin across eternity it reached. Not because of power, because of familiarity. The throne did not answer. It did not need to. Already been heard. Lucifer opened his eyes, not in expectation, in stillness. He was not hoping for a return. He was not seeking restoration. He was remembering how to breathe without exile. And in that breath he became, if only for a heartbeat, who he had once been. Not a king of shadow, not a bearer of pride, but the first light. The one who sang joy into the corners of creation before sorrow had a name. The one who stood beside Michael at dawn and marveled at stars being born. The one who laughed in light before he wept in silence. And for that moment he did not ache. He simply was, not broken, not fallen, just light, not seen, but heard. And in the heart of heaven, where time folds like wings and mercy never sleeps, something stirred, not in rage, not by invitation, but in mourning. For even the throne, in all its perfection, still remembers the first voice that ever sang beneath it. And though it does not call him home, it still listens, because love never forgets its first echo. And so in the quiet space between pulses of the cosmos, he stood, not waiting, not weeping, but glowing. Not with fire, not with power, but with something gentler. The light that returns when all other lights are gone. The kind of light that doesn't seek to be seen, only to be near. He did not ascend. He did not descend. He simply turned and walked into the wind again. But this time the air shimmered behind him, as if something unseen followed, not a host, not a curse, a memory of when he danced through galaxies not yet formed, when stars sang in harmony with his presence, when creation pulsed in rhythm with his joy. And the universe, vast as it had become, still remembered the tempo. Lucifer walked through a canyon where light never touched, and yet the walls glowed faintly as he passed. They remembered, they always would, because there is something the holy have never said aloud. That light once given cannot be taken, only turned. And this was never undone, only redirects. Beneath the weight of exile, beneath the centuries of silence, beneath the shroud of pride and pain and endless wandering, the light still lived. Not in defiance. In defiance it would burn, but this light did not burn, it ached, it whispered, it hummed. And every so often, when the sky is silent enough and the soul still enough, you can hear it. A thread of sorrow woven through the stars, a voice once called beloved, still echoing, not to return, not to rule, but simply to be heard. And it is heard by the wind that cradles the mountains, by the soil that bears the weight of our forgetting, by the fire that remembers how it once danced for him in joy, not fear. And perhaps, though none would dare speak it, by the heavens themselves, not with favor, but with familiarity. For light cannot unknow its origin, and neither can he who gave it. Lucifer's path now led him to the edge of what cannot be named, a place where stars no longer chart the sky, where time folds in on itself like wings withdrawing from flight. It is not death, it is not life, it is the breath between both. The seam of creation. Here even silence is sacred. He stood at the threshold where light and darkness are no longer opposites but companions, and he whispered, not words, wounds. He offered them to the stillness like an offering, not for healing but for holding. The air trembled not with power but with awareness, the kind of trembling that happens when something forgotten becomes felt again. And from the depths of that unspeakable stillness something responded, not in voice, in presence. It moved through him like warmth returning to limbs too long in the cold. Not forgiveness, not wrath, something deeper, recognition. The divine did not reach for him, but it did not turn away. And that, in the language of the eternal, is a beginning. Lucifer did not kneel. He had done so once in a desert that remembered. Now he stood, not tall, not proud, but open. And from that openness his light rose, not to dazzle, to return, not to the throne, to the silence before it. And in that silence he sang once more, a single note, so soft, so sorrowful, so sacred it echoed still. The note did not rise like a flame. It unfolded like dusk, gentle, patient, inevitable. It did not cry out to be heard, it waited to be felt. And as it drifted into the spaces between stars, into the folds of forgotten praise and unfinished songs, the heavens did not answer, but they did not close, because some sounds cannot be judged, only held, and this was one of them. The note lingered in soil, in starlight, in the trembling breath of prophets who wake from dreams they cannot name. It pressed itself into the memory of creation, not as rebellion, not as lament, but as longing. A longing older than sin, older than time, a longing not to return but to be remembered rightly. Lucifer lowered his gaze. The stars above him blinked, unsure whether to hide or shine. The air shifted around him, soft as breath, sharp as truth. And in that moment he knew he would never go back, and heaven would never call him. But the light he bore, twisted, wounded, wandering, was still part of the first flame. And no silence, no exile, no flood, no fall could unmake that. He turned from the edge of uncreation, walked back into the world not as a prince, not as a pariah, but as a presence, not to be followed, not to be feared, but to be known by wind, by shadow, by silence, by every broken thing that still holds a spark. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of the story, the voice that once named him watched, and though it said nothing, it listened, because even the divine remembers the light.